Imagine you are standing on a battlefield. The sky is dark. The ground is shaking. Enemy forces are moving closer. Thousands of soldiers are waiting for one command. Then suddenly a young American lieutenant picks up a radio. It says only a few words. No shouting, no long speech. Just a simple radio message. And within seconds the horizon explodes. Hundreds of artillery guns hidden miles away fire almost at the exact same moment. More than 12-headed weapons unleash a storm of destruction. The enemy has no idea where it came from. They only know one thing: America's artillery has arrived. But how was it possible? How could one person with one radio call control hundreds of massive guns spread across a battlefield? The answer was not just firepower. It was technology, mathematics, communication, and one of the most advanced military systems ever created. This is the story of how American commanders turned a simple radio call into a battlefield weapon. The power of artillery throughout history. Armies have always searched for a way to strike enemies from a distance. Before aircraft, before missiles, before modern weapons, there was artillery. The idea was simple. Instead of sending soldiers directly into danger, armies could use giant cannons to attack enemy positions from far away. During the early wars, artillery was slow. A commander had to estimate the enemy's location. Soldiers had to manually adjust the guns. Messages moved slowly. A mistake of a few hundred yards could mean the difference between victory and failure. But during World War II, warfare changed forever. The United States developed one of the most powerful artillery systems in military history. American artillery units were not just groups of soldiers firing random shells. They were carefully organized machines. Every person had a role. Some soldiers operated the guns, some calculated firing data, some tracked enemy movements, some communicated with commanders. And at the center of everything was the forward observer, the person who could see the battlefield, the person who could call the fire, the person who could decide where hundreds of shells would land. The lieutenant on the front line and the forward observer was often a young officer, sometimes a lieutenant who was only in his early 20s. But his responsibility was enormous. He was positioned close to the enemy. He carried binoculars, a map, a radio, and the ability to call down one of the most powerful attacks available to the army. His job was dangerous. He had to move with infantry units. He had to identify enemy positions. He had to calculate distance and direction. And most importantly, he had to communicate clearly. Because thousands of lives depended on a few words through a radio. A typical call might sound simple, but behind those words was an entire system. The lieutenant would identify himself, give the target location, describe the enemy position, request a specific amount of fire. Then artillery crews hundreds or even thousands of yards away would receive the message. Within moments, the guns were ready. How one radio call controlled hundreds of guns. So how did one lieutenant command 100 guns? The secret was not one gun. It was coordination. American artillery units were connected through a network. A single request could travel from the front line to multiple artillery batteries. Each battery knew its position. Each gun crew knew its job. The calculations were already organized. The commanders knew which weapons could reach the target. This meant the lieutenant did not need to personally call every single cannon. He only needed to contact the Fire Direction Center. The Fire Direction Center was basically the brain of the operation. Here, officers and specialists received the information. They calculated distance, angle, shell type, timing, and the number of guns required. Then the order was sent. Hundreds of artillery crews could prepare at the same time. The battlefield became connected by radio waves, one voice, hundreds of weapons, one command, massive destruction. The time-on-target revolution, one of the most impressive techniques used by American artillery, was called time on target. The idea was incredible. Instead of firing whenever a gun was ready, different artillery units calculated their shots so that all shells arrived at the target at the same second. Think about what that meant. A gun located nearby might fire later. A gun located far away might fire earlier, because the shells traveled different distances. But with perfect calculations, all the shells would reach the enemy together. Imagine being an enemy soldier. You hear nothing, no warning, no single explosion. Then suddenly hundreds of artillery shells arrive at once. The first impact is already happening before the enemy even understands what is happening. This created a psychological effect as powerful as the physical damage. The enemy was not facing one attack. They were facing a storm. The technology behind the firepower, the weapons themselves were impressive. The American forces used powerful artillery pieces such as the M-4 5mm howitzer. These guns could fire heavy explosive shells over long distances, but the real advantage was the system behind them. A single cannon was dangerous, but the coordinated artillery network was devastating. The United States focused heavily on communication. Radios allowed commanders to react quickly. Maps allowed accurate targeting. trained officers turned battlefield information into firing solutions. The result was a level of coordination that many armies struggled to match. American artillery became known as one of the most effective forces on the battlefield. The human seed but behind every artillery strike were real people. The young soldiers working under extreme pressure, the gun crews who loaded heavy shells, the radio operators listening for commands, the officers making decisions in seconds. A mistake could send shells to the wrong location. A delay could cost soldiers their lives. The lieutenant calling for fire was not just giving an order, he was making a decision that affected everyone around him. He had to trust the calculations, he had to trust the people behind him, and he had to trust himself. Because once that command was sent, there was no turning back. The image of a single lieutenant picking up the radio and unleashing hundreds of guns sounds almost impossible, but it was real. It was a result of planning, communication, and military innovation. A simple radio message became the trigger for one of the most powerful battlefield systems ever created. In the next part, we will explore the famous battles where American artillery changed the outcome of entire campaigns, and how this technology influenced modern warfare forever. Return to the battlefield, the radio crackles. A young lieutenant looks through his binoculars. In front of him is an enemy position hidden behind hills, forests, and defensive lines. His soldiers are waiting. The enemy is preparing to attack. The lieutenant knows that sending infantry forward would be costly, so he reaches for the radio. A few seconds later, his message travels through the communication network. Far away, hundreds of artillery crews receive the order. The men jump into action. Shells are loaded. Coordinates are checked. Cannons are aimed. And then the battlefield begins to shake. This was the power of American artillery during World War II. It was not just about having bigger guns. It was about turning information into destruction faster than any enemy could react. And some of the most famous battles in history proved exactly how powerful this system had become. The invasion of Normandy with the sky turned into fire June 6, 1944, a day that would become one of the most famous moments in military history. The Allied invasion of Normandy had begun. Thousands of American, British, and Canadian troops crossed the English Channel toward Nazi-occupied France. But before soldiers landed on the beaches, the battlefield was already being transformed by artillery. German defenses were waiting. Bunkers, machine gun positions, strong defensive points. The Allies needed to weaken these positions before troops moved inland. Artillery became one of the most important weapons. American commanders coordinated massive fire support. Ships offshore fired enormous naval guns. Land-based artillery units prepared attacks. Airplanes struck targets from above. Everything was connected. The goal was simple: break the enemy's ability to fight before the soldiers arrived. But Normandy also showed the difficulty of artillery warfare. Too much fire could destroy enemy positions, but it could also damage areas that Allied troops needed to capture. Timing was everything. A few minutes could change the entire battle. This was why communication was so important. A lieutenant with a radio was not just requesting explosions, he was controlling battlefield movement. The Battle of the Bulge, America's artillery stops a massive attack December 1944. Germany launched one of its final major offensives in the Western Front. The attack became known as the Battle of the Bulge. German forces pushed through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. They wanted to split Allied armies and capture important locations. At first, the attack shocked American forces. The weather was terrible. Snow covered the battlefield. Visibility was poor. Many soldiers were exhausted, but American artillery became one of the reasons the German advance slowed. When enemy forces moved forward, artillery units responded quickly. The radio network allowed commanders to send fire missions rapidly. A request from the front line could become a massive artillery strike within minutes. American soldiers often described the sound as endless, the ground shaking, the sky filled with explosions. The enemy could not move freely. Roads became dangerous. Troop movements became difficult. Supplies could not move easily. Artillery was not just destroying targets, it was controlling the battlefield. The secret advantage, fire direction centers. The real genius behind American artillery was not only the guns, it was the organization. Every major artillery operation depended on fire direction centers. Think of them like the control rooms of a modern operation. Information came in. Enemy locations, troop movements, target coordinates, weather conditions, then specialists calculated the best response. They decided which guns should fire, how many rounds, what angle, what timing. This allowed different artillery units to work together. A battery miles away could support soldiers it had never seen. A commander at the front could request help, and the system connected everyone. The enemy might see one American soldier, but behind that soldier was an entire network of power. White 100 guns firing together as terrifying a single artillery shell was already dangerous, but hundreds firing together created something completely different. The psychological effect was massive. Soldiers on the receiving end did not know where the attack was coming from. They could not easily identify every gun position. They could not simply fight back against the explosions. The attack seemed almost unstoppable. And imagine standing in a trench. You hear the first explosion, then another, then hundreds. The earth moves, the air becomes filled with smoke and dust, communication breaks down, movement becomes almost impossible. This was the reason artillery was called the king of battle, because it could decide the outcome before soldiers even reached the enemy. The role of the American lieutenant who made that radio call represented a new kind of battlefield commander. He was not always the strongest soldier, he was not always the most experienced, but he had something extremely valuable: information. Modern warfare was becoming a battle of speed. Who could see the enemy first? Who could communicate faster? Who could respond quicker? The lieutenant became the connection between the battlefield and the artillery system. His eyes saw the target, his voice activated the attack, his decisions changed the battle. But the pressure was enormous. One wrong coordinate could cause disaster. One misunderstanding could waste valuable ammunition. Every call mattered. The evolution into modern warfare, the methods developed during World War II, changed military strategy forever. The idea of combining observation communication technology and firepower became the foundation of modern warfare. Today's militaries use advanced computers, satellites, drones, and digital communication. But the basic concept remains the same. A soldier identifies a target. Information travels through a network. Weapons respond. The difference is speed. Modern systems can calculate and strike faster than ever, but the foundation was created by the radio operators and artillery officers of earlier generations. The human cost of artillery: while artillery was powerful, it was also destructive. Every explosion represented real consequences. Soldiers on both sides experienced the terrifying reality of artillery warfare. The noise, the fear, the uncertainty. Many veterans later remembered artillery attacks as some of the most frightening moments of combat, because unlike a visible enemy soldier, artillery could strike from far away. You could not always see it coming. You could only hear the warning when it was already too late. This made artillery one of the most feared weapons of the 20th century. The legacy of the radio call: a simple radio call from a lieutenant may sound like a small moment, but behind that call was an entire machine. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of weapons, years of training, advanced calculations, and a system designed to turn information into action. That is why American artillery became legendary, because the United States did not simply build powerful weapons. It built a way for those weapons to work together. One voice could reach hundreds of guns. One command could change a battlefield, and one radio call could create an explosion powerful enough to be remembered for generations. History often remembers the generals, the famous battles, the final victories, but sometimes history changes because of a single person holding a radio, a young lieutenant, a battlefield map, and a few words sent into the air. Those words traveled through the network, reached hundreds of guns, and changed the course of war. Because in modern warfare, the most powerful weapon is not always the biggest gun. Sometimes it is the person who knows exactly when to say, fire,